Hi, I'm Ari, I'm the Oak Witch, and in today's video I'm going to be going over the historical development of the Wheel of the Year. So in this video today I'm going to be going over how we got to this modern concept of a Wheel of the Year, and I'm not going to be discussing the origins of the festivals individually. I'm going over how the concept of this wheel of pagan festivals came to be as it is today. So that's just a disclaimer. I'm not really going to be going into the ancient origins of the festivals and looking into their cultural context. That will be for a separate video, maybe a part 2. But in this video I'm going to be going over how this wheel was created, who was substantial in developing those ideas, and how it got to this modern 8-fold calendar of festivals. We can start with defining what is the Wheel of the Year. It's something which is widely celebrated, acknowledged by many modern pagans, many magical practitioners such as occultists, witches or folk magicians do tend to acknowledge this calendar of 8 seasonal festivals that happen throughout the year at fixed dates. There's many people who choose to not celebrate it now. I've mentioned in my last video how it's not really something I'm acknowledging as much as I used to when I was younger, but I mentioned how it's widely celebrated. It's something which I see in in-person communities in the UK. It's quite widely acknowledged, and even online you see a lot of posts at each festival of the year where people just generally say happy summer solstice to those who celebrate. So it's something which generally as a community we tend to acknowledge. And people acknowledge these festivals as being in tune with the ebbs and flows of the natural world around them. And the festivals themselves are split into 2 different sort of sections. So we have cross-quarter days and we have the quarter days. The cross-quarter days are also traditionally referred to as the greater Sabbats, with the quarter days being traditionally referred to as the lesser Sabbats. The greater Sabbats are loosely based on the ancient Irish Celtic fire festivals, and they are as follows. We have Imbolc on the 1st or 2nd of February, we have Bealtaine on the 30th of April or the 1st of May, we have Lunasa on the 31st of July or 1st of August, and we have Samhain on the 31st of October or the 1st of November. We also have different names for these festivals based upon cultural variations of festivals based on the same dates, but that can be for the second part of this video. I'll go into that in the next video. So we get to the second set of festivals, which are the lesser Sabbats, but are essentially the equinoxes and the solstices, and their reconstruction is based upon Norse, Germanic and Anglo-Saxon sources of their worship. So we have the spring equinox on the 21st of March, we have the summer solstice on the 21st of June, we have the autumn equinox on the 21st of September, and of course we have the winter solstice on the 21st of December. The dates of the equinoxes and solstices actually do vary based upon tradition or astronomical fact. Nowadays people kind of casually observe the festival perhaps a day or 2 within the range of the fixed date. And what's worth considering is that people have actually put on different names to these festivals as the wheel has developed, and I'll get to that later. But first, let's go over perhaps the origins of this concept of a wheel of the year. I'm going to try create a rough timeline as to notable figures who was perhaps very substantial in helping create this idea of a wheel pagan calendar. Of course, history is a little bit more nuanced than just set people in a linear fashion coming up with this idea. There's a lot of inspiration taken from different places as things like this develop, and there's certainly not enough time in this video for me to be able to go over everything, but from the research that I've done and resources I'll put in the video description that you can check out, these are the substantial figures that seemingly helped this idea of this pagan wheel of the year come into fruition. And we can start with a rough date estimation of 1792 to 1826. Here we can start with Welsh poet and antiquarian Edward Williams, also commonly known as Iolo Morganwg, I think that's how you pronounce it. And Ronald Hutton, in his article in the journal Folklore, identifies 2 people who were quite substantial in being the intellectual roots in this examination of the Wheel of the Year. So one being Edward Williams and 2 being Margaret Murray. Margaret Murray I'll talk about a bit later on. So we'll look at Edward Williams for now. So he was quite fundamental in impacting the modern Druid movement, and he was really determined to find evidence of pre-Christian Druid teachings in literature, but when he didn't find any, he resorted to forgery. He kind of did a little bit of forgery and passed off his teachings as a scholastic discovery. And it was during these years, 1792 to 1826, which he came up with a set of 4 festivals that the Druids observed. So this is the 21st of December, or Alban Arthan, the 21st of March, Alban Eilir, the 21st of June, Alban Hefin, and the 23rd of September, Alban Elfed. So he came up with these names and kind of listed these as 4 Druidic solar festivals. This was cemented in the understanding that the megalithic monument Stonehenge was built as a way to observe the sun's patterns throughout the year. As we know, the Stonehenge archway is actually built to align with the midsummer sunrise, as you can kind of see in this kind of picture on this book. And later archaeologists in the late 19th century actually validated this even further when looking at Stonehenge. Ronald Hutton in his article actually writes how it took ages for people to actually realise that Edward Williams' work was forgery. It wasn't until the early 20th century where Welsh academics actually came to this conclusion, and there's still people that don't realise to this day, but because of Edward Williams' writings, it really set a precedence for the development of modern Druidry, and he inspired a lot of modern Druidry. So it's from here we have this concept of these set dates put in place. There are a few notable names to talk about when we're discussing the development of the pagan movement and archaeological understandings and anthropological works that were really substantial in this concept of the developing pagan movement. There's so many notable people to talk about. But I'm going to jump to 1835 with Jacob Grimm, who in this year started publishing a 4-volume work called Deutsche Mythology, and it was a massive work on Germanic mythology, analysing ancient beliefs and those superstitious records and tracing their survival in records such as folklore. It was in here that the concept of there being pivotal points throughout the year in which ancient people celebrated the turning of the year in this wheel-like fashion was first suggested. He talks about this at length in his 3rd volume of this book, also called Teutonic Mythology in English, where he identifies Easter, May Day, the summer solstice, and winter solstice as prime times for sacrifices, feasts, celebration, dance by ancient peoples throughout the year. It was in this work that the idea of witches being members of a surviving pagan fertility cult was actually first introduced, along with this concept of a Germanic spring goddess called Eostir that was conceptualized based on pretty much entirely linguistic reconstruction, which both are heavily debated in their reliability and accuracy today. Moving forward in time to around 1857 to 1884, we get to Wilhelm Mannhardt. He was a German folklorist who actually worked underneath Jacob Grimm, and during those years, 1857 to 1884, he collated a lot of different agricultural folk customs and analysed the animistic or magical beliefs that underlied them. And obviously inspired heavily by Jacob Grimm, he further championed this concept of a fertility cult that underlied a lot of these ancient European religions. Ronald Hutton in Triumph of the Moon actually identifies William Mannhardt as a forerunner for James Frazer's The Golden Bough, who I'll get into now. So we're at 1890 and James George Frazer has just published his work The Golden Bough, which is a comparative study into various mythologies and traditions. James George Frazer was a Scottish anthropologist and folklorist, very notable in this work for comparing different mythologies and ancient religious traditions or beliefs and identifying a shared component of a fertility cult that centered around this worship of a dying and reviving god. This regeneration of a god was representative of the regeneration of nature and vegetation in the natural world, and was further represented in human form by this concept of sacred kings. Here he actually gives Jesus Christ as an example of a sacred king and boils Christ down to another representation of such symbolism, so just another superstition. For its time it was quite a controversial publication, being put into a very Christian society, so its not so subtle aim was to discredit and undermine Christianity by exploring these various ancient superstitions and beliefs. But As a result, this work was highly, highly influential and went on to really aid in the development of many different traditions. Paganism, occultism, or magical paths in general, but in particular this work definitely influenced Robert Graves, who went on to write the very influential The White Goddess, but also Margaret Murray. Now we're jumping to around 1921 here, but Margaret Murray is someone whose name you are probably already familiar with. Margaret Murray was an Egyptologist, a historian, an archaeologist, an anthropologist, and folklorist, and her book, released in 1921, The Witch Cult in Western Europe, is very well known for its now discredited theory on the witch cult. This witch cult hypothesis theory claims that the witch trial records is evidence of a surviving pre-Christian pagan religion worshipping a horned god. She wrote how this horned god is a representation of the cyclical regeneration of nature, and how these fertility cults or religions are based around the worship of this horned god. So you can see there in the regeneration of nature the representation of this by a male god figure. It's definitely inspired by those works that came before her. In this work she also touches on this concept of the witch's Sabbath, which is something which I spoke about in my video on spirit flight. She writes in here that witches regularly met at specific times, at Esbats primarily for business ventures, and at larger meetings called the Sabbats. These Sabbats were held at certain fixed times of the year and were primarily religious in nature, which she writes. She claims here that the use of the term Sabbat actually comes from the French word sabatre. I tried to find a pronunciation of this online, but I couldn't, but I'll have the spelling here. But it means to frolic, and she claims that the word Sabbath does not come from the Jewish ceremonial Sabbath. But yeah, she claims that there were chief festivals at certain points throughout the year where witches met in large gatherings, also called Great Assemblies, and these were the dates. So she claims there was May Eve, April 30th, November Eve, October 31st, Candlemas, February 2nd, and the Ghoul of August 1st. She later reiterates her stance in her book God of the Witches, published in 1933, where she claims again that there were 4 important days, these days, that opened up the seasons. Now, of course, there's a lot more to say about Margaret Murray and the influence that she had on the modern pagan movement, of which you can find a really detailed history in this book. But I'm going to jump now to 1954 with a man called Gerald Gardner, who was very, very influenced by Margaret Murray's works. Now, there's a lot to say about this guy. He is often called the father of Wicca, but he was a British man, amateur anthropologist, and authored several books. I won't go too much into his life and his development of Wicca because of course there is so much to say. And this video is more centered around the Wheel of the Year in its historical development. I'm not really going to be going into Wicca as an initiatory tradition. I of course can do another video on that, but for now I'm kind of going to narrow down the Wheel of the Year and how this got developed based upon Gerald Gardner's work and life. And the most important timeline in his life to focus on when looking at the Wheel of the Year is in his later years. Throughout his life he travelled and moved around a lot, living a significant proportion of his life in the East, but in his later years in 1930s he moved and settled down to the south of England, more specifically the New Forest area. It's here in the New Forest that he joined a Rosicrucian group called the Teutonic Fellowship, and allegedly through this group he was introduced to a local witch coven that had survived a ancient witchcraft lineage. The person who initiated him was called Old Dorothy, and apparently he worked in this coven for several years. During these years he met Aleister Crowley of the OTO, who honestly deserves an entire video to talk about how crusty this man was. But that's a separate video. I'm not going to go into Aleister Crowley today because it would just be very, very long to explain. But he's worth noting because as Gardner eventually publicised his ritual materials, it was clearly very influenced by many people around him and the traditions he came into contact with. So the OTO, the Golden Dawn, Rosicrucianism, he was a Freemason as well, and I think he was a member of a Druid order as well. So there was lots of different influences that clearly had an impact on his ritual material. But again, that's a separate video on Wicca that I'll talk about, but I just wanted to explain because obviously that does tie into when we're looking at the Wheel of the Year. So speaking of this material, he decided to make it public in 1946, where his coven that he was working with actually allowed him to publicise their material in the disguise of a fiction novel called High Magic's Aid. So this was because there was actually still anti-witchcraft laws still in act up until 1951, where the Witchcraft and Vagrancy Acts were repealed. So this allowed witches and magical practitioners to be more open about what they do and advertise it without the fear of being prosecuted. So yes, as mentioned before, he was an amateur anthropologist and was heavily taken by Margaret Murray's theories of this surviving witch cult. So in his 1954 book Witchcraft Today, and later in his 1959 book The Meaning of Witchcraft, he talks about this concept of the survival of witchcraft, and then further talks about his first-hand experience of stumbling across a surviving witch coven in the New Forest. Of course, there has been numerous analysis into his statements, his claims by many different historians, and there's been a lot of conclusions pretty much saying there is not much evidence for it. Again, Ronald Hutton talks about this at length in this book. It's very, very good. So whether or not you believe it, that's a different story. But yes, trying to make it concise, so we're going to move over to this concept of Gardner's Book of Shadows. Gardner's Book of Shadows had several different editions and actually had a precursor called Ye Book of the Art Magical, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, but what's important to note here is that Gardner's Book of Shadows had several different editions and different people kind of adding different things, but most notably Doreen Valiente, someone who again deserves an entire video dedicated to her, took the book and rewrote significant portions of it, particularly a ritual material which she says was quite Crowley inspired, quite obviously Crowley influenced, so she added her own material. So as I said earlier in this video, there was traditionally an emphasis on the Greater Sabbaths, or these quarter days, but it was actually the members of Gardner's Hertfordshire Coven who didn't like there was so much emphasis on these Greater Sabbaths and asked for there to be equal emphasis on both the Greater Sabbaths and the Lesser Sabbaths, and Gardner obliged. There was adjustments made to the Book of Shadows, and that inspired the first understanding of the 8 festivals of the Wheel of the Year as we know it today. So what I haven't actually mentioned yet is that Gerald Gardner was quite an attention seeker. He wanted to make witchcraft public. He wanted to publicise his witchcraft to the masses, and he went through a lot of interviews. So of course through this and through trying to make his witchcraft public through his books, of course this has substantial effects on this concept of, you know, the Sabbats, the witches' rituals, the Wheel of the Year being publicised, being put to the masses, being more popular. Around Gardner's time, people around him and the people he initiated and the Wiccan traditions that branched off of his lineage, there are so many notable names that really helped push the modern pagan witchcraft movement forward and make it so what it is today. There are so many people to talk about. Raymond Buckland is known for being one of the people to bring it to the United States, but the person I want to talk about is Nichols. So of course around this time this Wiccan template of these 8 seasonal festivals was spreading, and one of the people that helped in this was Gardner's friend Nichols, who was a Druid. In 1964 he founded the Druidic order, the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, also commonly called the Obod. And here in his tradition he reinstated the 8 seasonal festivals template. I'm going to pick up the pace and we're now going to go over to 1974 and we're going to talk about Aidan Kelly. So Ronald Hutton in, again, The Triumph of the Moon, talks about how there was 5 key writers who were really substantial in analysing Gerald Gardner's texts and trying to decipher their origins. So these included Janet and Stewart Farrar, commonly known for this book, it's quite popular of theirs, The Witch's Bible, and maybe also this one if anyone's heard of it, Spells and How They Work. Doreen Valiente, as mentioned before, she authored many books, Witchcraft for Tomorrow, ABC on Witchcraft, Natural Magic, The Rebirth of Witchcraft. She authored a lot of different books. She had an entire history of going between traditions. She worked with Robert Cochrane. There's a lot to talk about. Again, that'll be a different video. But she was very notable as one of these writers as well. Philip Heselton, who again is another author. He's done a lot of different books on Doreen Valiente on Gerald Gardner. He did one recently called In Search of the New Forest Coven. I've not read any of them, but apparently they're history books. And Aidan Kelly. So Aidan Kelly actually made substantial contributions in helping publish Gerald Gardner's works, and actually was one of the first to identify the precursor to Gerald Gardner's Book of Shadows called Ye Book of Ye Art Magical or something like that. So apparently Aidan Kelly, when attempting to recreate a pagan witch religion heavily inspired by Margaret Murray and Gerald Gardner, took this eightfold set of festivals and put his own spin on them based on ancient mythologies and Edwardian or Victorian literature. It was him who decided to put the names Letha, Mabon and Ostara on the festivals, summer solstice, autumn equinox and spring equinox. He actually wrote a blog on Pathos where he gave his explanations as to why he chose these names, and again, that will be in the references, you can have a read of that yourself. But this is a quote from the blog. Back in 1974, I was putting together a pagan craft calendar, the first of its kind as far as I know, listing the holidays, astrological aspects and other stuff interest to pagans. We have Gaelic names for the 4 Celtic holidays. It offended my aesthetic sensibilities that there seemed to be no pagan names for the summer solstice or the fall equinox equivalent to Yule or Beltane, so I decided to supply them. So his reasonings for giving Letha to the spring equinox was based upon the Venerable Bede's writings. The Venerable Bede was an early medieval monk from around 673 CE, I think that was when he was born, just to give a perspective on when he was alive. But he did have some substantial writings, and one of which Aidan Kelly took from was this idea that Letha was the Anglo-Saxon word for the midsummer season. So Aidan Kelly took that and decided to put Letha on the summer solstice. Ostara too came from the Venerable Bede, where in Bede's writings he wrote that the spring equinox was sacred to a Saxon goddess called Ostara. The reasoning for giving Mabon to the autumn equinox is a little bit more convoluted, I'd say, as he suggests that the Welsh myth from the Mabinogi of Gwydion and Mabon ad Modron parallels the ancient Greek myths of the goddess Demeter and the Eleusinian mysteries. But he claims this was important to him as the Athenian calendar was lunisolar, so the religion of Greece actually started on the full moon nearest to the fall equinox. He wanted a Northern European equivalent, so he looked to the Mabinogi, saw Mabon and decided to just slap it onto the autumn equinox. These names entered pagan vocabulary in the United States, where he wrote a lot for the widely read journal The Green Egg, and quite honestly the names just stuck, and then it became very popular over there, and then it bled back right to Britain. And honestly, the rest is history. Things become normalised, vocabulary gets shared, and it just becomes a part of community. People start using it more, then it becomes normal, and as we know it, we have this Wheel of the Year that's been developed on so much as it gets written about in all these books. People have their own spin on them, people kind of write from a very neo-pagan perspective, and the more that people sort of have their own spin on them or write about these festivals, the more that they develop, you know? So one of the biggest misconceptions is that these are ancient festivals predating to the Druids, but that isn't necessarily the case. The festivals as we know them today are likely nothing like what was celebrated and acknowledged back in the Iron Age or even prehistory, so it's definitely worth considering the history of this Wheel of the Year, how much has been adapted, developed, forged and put onto these festivals, as opposed to something which is ancient and surviving the Christianization of Europe. There's so much more to talk about with the individual festivals, their Gaelic origins and the Christianization of these festivals and the survival in folklore and folk traditions, the cultural variances across different European countries. There's so much to talk about, and I'd love to do another video on that, but that's not for today's video, I'm afraid. But that's certainly something I can do and work on for a future video. But yeah, I hope that gives a basic understanding of how this wheel came to be what it is today. Of course, there's so much more that's happened throughout history that I cannot fit into a video that's hopefully under 30 minutes. I just wanted to give a sort of basic timeline of notable figures that came up with certain ideas and inspired other people who inspired other people who spread the word, and then we get this wheel. So I hope this was interesting. If you learned anything new, let me know. If you like this video, give it a like, because it really helps me out. And yeah, I think one thing I want to say is that if you celebrate the Wheel of the Year, it's totally fine. I don't mean to come across as if like you shouldn't. It's up to you whether you do or whether you don't. I think it's a really nice way to acknowledge the land around you, but that's something which I'd like to give advice for my viewers and for anyone who's looking to start a pagan practice or a witchcraft practice that acknowledges the cycles of the nature around you. Don't rely too much on these fixed festivals that were pretty much developed for a certain climate, right? Pay attention to your land. These festivals are great as perhaps little reminders of being in tune with those natural cycles, but what's most important for you as an individual are the natural cycles literally around you, you know, stuff that is actually relevant and appropriate to you, to the land you walk on. Your relationship with your local land, I think, is going to be much more important and valuable, in my opinion, than something which perhaps you can't really even relate to. So I think that's just something to consider when we're looking at this modern celebration of this neo-pagan Wheel of the Year. It's great as a community-wide thing to acknowledge, but ultimately if you want to build a personal relationship to nature, to the nature around you, that's going to be something which is quite individual to you and not necessarily something as universal as a Wheel of the Year. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching if you got to the end. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.